The night Rod Serling was born, no one could have guessed what he'd grow up to hide inside his stories, or what it would cost him. Christmas Day, 1924. A grocer's son in a small town in upstate New York. An ordinary boy in an ordinary house. The war that would break him hadn't started yet. The show that would make him immortal was still decades away. And the one episode that would follow his legacy into a vault for 52 years, banned, buried, scrubbed from every rerun and every marathon as if it had simply never been filmed, was a nightmare nobody could have imagined for him yet. For over half a century, American television carried a ghost in its archive, not a lost pilot, not a forgotten reel gathering dust in some forgotten warehouse. A fully finished, fully aired episode of the most celebrated anthology series ever made, quietly erased from existence by the very network that once bragged about airing it. No monster did this. No alien, no supernatural twist, no cosmic irony delivered with a wink at the camera. What got an episode of the Twilight Zone banned for half a century was something far more human and far more dangerous than anything Serling ever dreamed up. The truth told a little too close to the bone in a country that wasn't ready to hear it. Before he became a man in the dark suit who spoke to America from the edge of its own subconscious, Rod Serling was just a soldier who came home wrong. He'd enlisted burning to fight in Europe, desperate to do something about the Nazis. Fate had other plans. The Army shipped him to the Pacific instead, where he became a paratrooper and watched some of the worst violence of the century unfold in front of him at the Battle of Leyte. He came home with a Purple Heart, a ruined knee, a battered wrist, and a silence in him that never fully lifted. Weeks later, his father dropped dead of a heart attack. Out of nowhere, no warning at all. Two griefs, stacked one on top of the other, before he'd even turned 25. Everything Serling wrote afterward, every haunted attic, every cursed object, every man who got exactly what he deserved in the last 30 seconds of the story, was built from that wound. He didn't invent monsters because he loved monsters. He invented them because they were the only costume real horror was allowed to wear on American television. Because here's the part people forget. In the golden age of TV, the sponsors ran the show, not the writers. If a lighter company paid for airtime, no character could strike a match on camera. If an automaker signed the check, rival car logos had to be erased in the background, building by building, block by block. Serling, a serious writer desperate to talk about real American ugliness, kept slamming into the same wall. The breaking point came when he tried to dramatize a real-life racial atrocity and watched the network sand it down, scene by scene, until the truth underneath it disappeared completely. By the time the sponsors finished with it, there was nothing left worth saying. That's when he had the idea that would change television forever. If the censors wouldn't let him talk about prejudice or war, or the rot sitting quietly at the center of ordinary people, he'd just move it somewhere else. Another planet, another dimension, paint the villain green, get him 4 arms, and suddenly nobody objects to morality play about bigotry, because a bigot is antennae now instead of face they recognize. In 1957, he tested the theory with a pitch called The Time Element, a story about a man trying to warn the past about Pearl Harbor before it happened. The network took one look and buried it in a vault. But when it finally aired, borrowed by another producer for a different program entirely, the reaction was so overwhelming that CBS had no choice but to hand Serling a series of his own. What followed was 5 years of a man using science fiction as a Trojan horse for everything television was too frightened to say out loud. He wasn't just the creator. He was the executive producer, the head writer, and, almost by accident, the voice of the whole enterprise, a role the network never intended for him. They wanted a professional narrator first, a legend from the newsreel era nicknamed the Voice of Doom for his booming, funereal delivery. It didn't work. He sounded too polished, too stiff, for a show that lived and breathed on imagination. They even flirted with hiring Orson Welles, until his price tag scared everyone off. So Serling stepped in front of his own camera almost by default, and it turned out to be the single smartest accident in television history. Long before they were household names, Robert Redford, William Shatner, and a teenage Ron Howard walked through his fifth dimension, each one a stand-in for an audience being quietly asked to look at itself. By the time the series ended in 1964, Sorling had written nearly 100 episodes about greed, fear, prejudice, and a particular cruelty of fate, and he'd done it all by lying just enough to tell the truth. But the show, remembered today as untouchable genius, nearly didn't survive its own network. CBS canceled it once because no sponsor wanted their name anywhere near something so strange. A network executive who openly despised the series swapped it out for a comedy that flopped so badly CBS crawled back, humiliated, begging Sorling to return. But only if he'd stretch his tight, surgical 30-minute scripts into bloated hour-long episodes that diluted everything sharp about them. By the time they reversed course and shrank it back down, the damage was already done. The audience had drifted. The urgency had thinned. The plug got pulled for good, and the strange little show about the space between light and shadow quietly went dark. And underneath all of it sat a grief Sorling could never fully write his way out of. In 1955, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi in an act of racial violence, so brutal it shook the conscience of the entire country. Sorling tried more than once to dramatize it honestly. Every single time, the network flinched and killed the project before it could breathe. It is not an exaggeration to say the entire premise of the Twilight Zone, alien metaphors standing in for human sins, exists because a network was too cowardly to let one writer tell the truth about a dead black teenager in the Deep South. Sorling built an empire out of that refusal. He turned network cowardice into his own private art form. Off camera, the man carrying all that weight was, by his own daughter's account, nothing like the somber prophet audiences saw every week. He was a practical joker who would put a lampshade on his head just to get a laugh at a party. When an actor died suddenly right after filming an episode, Sorling quietly paid to reshoot the entire thing out of his own pocket, rather than let footage he considered unworthy stand as someone's final work. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man who could stare into the worst of humanity for a living and still come home every night and be somebody's father. Perhaps that's the only way anyone survives doing what he did for as long as he did it. You make the darkness your job, and you keep whatever light is left over for people you love. Even the show's most iconic fingerprint, that 4-note theme everyone can hum without ever having seen a single episode, was born from the same scrappy improvisation as everything else. The original score had been written by a genuine legend, the same composer behind the scores for Psycho and Vertigo, but the network wasn't satisfied and went hunting for something else. What they landed on almost by accident, from a struggling composer overseas paid a few $100s for a rush job he barely remembered, became one of the most recognizable sounds in television history. Proof that even the parts of the zone that felt eerily perfect were, underneath, held together by desperation and duct tape. Which brings us, finally, to the episode nobody was supposed to remember at all. It aired only once. Titled The Encounter. It trapped two men in a cramped, sweltering attic on a hot afternoon. An aging, damaged World War II veteran named Fenton, and a young Japanese-American gardener named Arthur, played by a rising actor named George Takei, years before he'd ever set foot on the bridge of a starship. Between them sat a stolen samurai sword, a war trophy soaked in something that felt less like metal and more like memory itself. As the afternoon wore on, the sword seemed to work on the two men like a slow poison, stripping away every layer of politeness until what was left underneath was raw, ugly, and true. On its surface, it was one of the show's most searing statements about what war does to the human spirit long after shooting stops. But buried inside the script was a claim that crossed a line the show had never crossed before. It suggested that Arthur's own father had been a traitor at Pearl Harbor. It wasn't just dramatic license. It was historically false, and it landed as a direct insult to a Japanese-American community that had already survived the trauma of wartime internment, stripped of homes, businesses, and dignity by their own government, and now being handed, on national television, an accusation of betrayal they had never earned and never deserved. The timing made it worse. It aired just as the country was sliding into the Vietnam War, when the last thing America needed was a story reopening old wounds around loyalty, race, and who gets to be trusted. The backlash was immediate, and it was furious. CBS did something almost unheard of in the network's history. They didn't just quietly skip a rerun. They pulled the episode entirely, locked the negative away, and made certain it never appeared in syndication, never aired in a marathon, never even got mentioned in the show's own highlight reels. George Takei would later joke, with the kind of dark humor that only survives real pain, that it was the only episode of his entire career that never earned him a single residual check, because it never played again. Not once. Not for 52 years. It resurfaced almost by accident during a New Year's Day marathon in 2016, half a century after Vanished, decades after Sorley himself had died, in a country that had changed just enough to look back and finally understand what all the outrage had been about. What makes the encounter so chilling isn't the sword, or the supernatural tension, or even the twist ending. It's the fact that a show built entirely on using fiction to smuggle in uncomfortable truths finally told one truth too uncomfortable for anyone to sit with. And the very industry that praised Sorling for his fearlessness proved, in the end, that even it had its limits. Sorling died on June 28, 1975, at just 50 years old, his heart finally giving out after a lifetime spent staring directly at everything everyone else chose to look away from. He never lived to see his most controversial episode rehabilitated. He never got to explain what he meant by it, defend it, or apologize for it. He simply left it behind. One more ghost story in a career built almost entirely out of them. Maybe that's the real signpost up ahead. The most dangerous stories he ever told were never about aliens or curses or men bargaining with fate. They were the ones that held a mirror up so close to real American wounds that an entire network chose to look away for 50 years rather than let the country see its own reflection staring back. Rod Sorling spent his life proving that the scariest monsters were never hiding under the bed. Somewhere, locked in a vault at CBS for half a century, one episode quietly proved he was right about something else too. Sometimes the truth is the one thing even television can't forgive.